Good morning, all, and thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a really insightful and engaging webinar. As Reuben takes us on a journey for how to part with the platform for good and some of the lessons we've learned along the way. Just for some really quick introductions, I'm Adam, and I'm a client partner at Maytech. I'm working under our health division, and Reuben's a lead developer at Maytech, but will introduce himself fully in a moment. Next slide, please. There's some really quick kind of housekeeping about today's webinar. So the session is going to be recorded, so we can share it afterwards, which should be great. There'll also be an opportunity to ask questions, and if you can use the Q&A box rather than the chat box, that would be brilliant. And at the end of the session, I'll pose these questions to Reuben to answer. And at the end of the session, we'll also be sending out feedback forms. So if you could respond to these, that would be greatly appreciated. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Reuben.
Cool, thanks, Adam. Hello. So as Adam said, my name's Reuben. I'm a lead engineer at Maytech here. Probably since you're here, you know what Maytech do, but in case not, we're a consultancy that help public sector use technology to make a positive impact on society. I've been here for the best part of a year and really enjoyed kind of seeing that impact in action. Some of the work that Maytech's done in the past just in the year that I've been here has been really awesome and valuable. Personally, I like learning new things. I like understanding how stuff works, coming up with solutions to problems. Outside of work, you catch me trying to exercise some form of control over my children, or watching sports on TV, most likely, and occasionally out for a run. But at work, what do I do? So, you know, what do I favour? I care about employing good practices, empowering and unblocking teams, like being kind of a servant leader in that kind of role, trying to do things right with a test-first approach. And I've worked quite a bit on legacy transformations, but more recently been looking at using diagrams as code and documentation as code to facilitate architecture transparency as an architect right now. But that's not really what today is about. This is about decommissioning a platform on a project I recently, some learnings from a project I recently contributed on. So the agenda for today is planning a decommission, like what do you need to think about, what considerations are there. We got kind of some specifics around the, you know, a case study, a real life example of what we went through, some problems we experienced, and that sort of thing. Data was a big part of this, as you'll hear. And kind of lessons learned and how we've applied them into the next decommissioning, as well as like generally building software and what we can learn from this process. But before we talk about the planning, I'd like to take us through a little timeline of how this whole project lifecycle evolved. So coronavirus happened, and the government invested in this company that we Maytech worked with and helped provide a service for, a results matching service, but it had to be a little bit shoehorned in to fit its need. And then, you know, it was really taking off and became a pandemic. The service had to be resilient, right? So that wasn't really what it was built for. So what was the answer? Well, it was quite simply just a bit of vertical scaling and moving it to the cloud, like quite a tactical solution. And then coronavirus, you know, obviously was getting worse and more prevalent. We had some big scaling ups to do, lots of tests to process, and it wasn't really fit for purpose. We need to scale horizontally and have a slightly different approach to results handling. So what was the answer to that? And that's where Maytech kind of came on board to help build a serverless platform. I've referred to these as platform A, B, and C. These are kind of terminologies that we'll use throughout the presentation. Platform B is the main one I'll talk about today. And really key aspect of this, the bit where Maytech were involved on building this, helping to build this third serverless platform, was that it didn't target feature parity, right? It was more about what it needed to provide. Platform B was far more had far more function in it, far more behaviors, but we just needed to do what we needed to do for results matching for coronavirus tests. So it went on through, we got to about March 2021, and the serverless platform had kind of been done for LFTs, the lateral flow tests. The work carried on throughout that year to move so PCR still going through platform B. We brought those onto platform C. And then we started to look at how to migrate antibodies. So the 3 test types that we were using for COVID on platform B, 2 of them had come across, and then we started to look at antibodies. And then once that was done, the idea was that platform B could be decommissioned. Excuse me. So, but then March last year, there was like an announcement the antibody tests were going to stop, and therefore we didn't need platform B anymore after a certain date in July, I think it was, or maybe it was the end of June, the start of July. I can't quite remember the precise date. So we also at that time had a team rotation on the project. So MadeTech team changed around. So we had some new people come in. We had, I think, 5 new staff, including myself, come in at that period of time, and two of the other members had rolled off at the end of that period. So it was quite a lot of new people, new faces, without a lot of domain knowledge, and it slipped us by a little bit that the revelation of antibody tests stopping meant we could stop the work on platform C, but we did notice it eventually. So we could abandon that plan, and it meant we had a date in the future where we could stop processing antibodies on platform B. Platform B had reached kind of end of life. And that's really what this presentation is about. So it's MadeTech had helped to build this serverless platform. We didn't have a lot of domain knowledge on platform B. A new team came in with not very much domain knowledge, a lot of data unknowns, a lot of risks associated with it, and what did we do? So then we carried on, and then by September last year, the platform B was like fully switched off with all the data requirements and stuff met. And as a little bonus in some respects to put the decommissioning learnings to bed, we also had to decommission or help to manage the decommission for platform C. So the NHS made a strategic move to use a new provider on their results matching services, which we'll talk about a bit as well, because it's quite important when you're thinking about how we decommission. So yes, that's a timeline of events. Hopefully it sets context quite nicely. So planning a decommission, some of the things to think about, we decided to have a planning phase, a discovery kind of kickoff iteration, because we didn't have that greater knowledge about the platform. We wanted to understand it more. We needed some meetings to understand what the requirements were from the stakeholders and so on. So there's two kind of sets of users to think about with the considerations. The people that aren't in the team. So what do they need from the decommissioning? So what do the stakeholders need? And what are their priorities? What does done look like for them? There's internal folk, right? So people from the company that are currently providing the service, same kinds of questions. What do they think done looks like? But also, do any of their teams depend on your packages? Have you stood something up that they're using? Are you maybe the last team using a service that company's paying for, like a VPN gateway or a CI build server or a license for, JetBrains or something, who knows? And then the end users, of course, probably the most important in some ways. How are they going to be affected by decommissioning? Do they need rerouting? Do they need emailing, notifying? Is the user need still there, or is the service replacing it? So to take that back to our example, in platform B, the user need wasn't there anymore because there were no antibody tests. But for platform C, the new service was replacing it. So, was that transparent to the public? And then also some more data considerations around, if you're giving it to the new provider, that people whose data is being sent over need to be notified and that sort of thing. And then the second set of users, which is the team, So that's us as technologists. What did we need to know, and how are we going to get to something that we can call done? So for us, and this will be different for every decommissioning really, but for us, the three main things were understanding the path to production. So we didn't have that knowledge of the technology stack. What services are involved, what repositories get deployed, what credentials do you need, environment settings, secret management tools, all that sort of thing. Dependencies, so the kind of bit less visible things, what dependencies are involved between the application and the infrastructure, what modules depend on something else. Is everything automated? Is everything provisioned by code, or are there some manual steps involved? And lastly, the data restrictions. What do we do about all the data stores? What does the contract say? What did GDPR say? Do we need to keep the data, or should we keep the data? How do we meet the organizational policies? What are the organizational policies? So we used our discovery phase for kind of answering a lot of those questions. And then we got the plan on the right-hand side of this slide. So our decisions, really, our phases of decommissioning were firstly to save money. So that was, as often is, a primary consideration for stakeholders. And also, don't delete any data until decisions have been made. So we have all this data, we need to decommission and turn stuff off, but we weren't allowed, I suppose, to delete any data until we had been given the green light by the NHS and by the business. Now these decisions are kind of our decisions for this discovery. So like I say, it could be different in future, but it's about getting those priorities and understanding the considerations. So saving the money, unbuilding it slowly, because we didn't want to accidentally delete any data stores, and then finally delete everything towards the end once any data had been transferred or copied or decided to be kept or put into cold storage, whatever it might be. So this is a couple of examples of what we got out of the discovery phase. These were some of the dependencies of the modules. Lots of arrows and boxes. There's no need to dive into the depths of it, but it's how things got deployed, what they depended on, what the blast radius of removing them was. There's dotted lines on there which kind of come out of the environment into more like a subscription level layer for the cloud provider. And some of these modules called into shared infrastructure components as well. So 3 or 4 of these are all VM based components. So we couldn't just delete the module because that would have affected everything at the same time. So this is a sort of artifact we were looking at producing for us as engineers. And then we've got the data. So we spent a long time trying to work out what all the data dependencies were. We had a slightly more stakeholder friendly version of this for distributing with the business and with the NHS. But there's different types of all sorts of different data in there. There's relational databases, document databases, persisted data there. So there's user action logs or vulnerability assessments. There's NSG, network security group, flow auditing. There's outbound report storage, application logging, and VM monitoring. So there's a whole raft of everything you would think of really there that we had to identify and then kind of explain and put down, understand at what point it could be done. So with knowing all the dependencies, knowing what modules, what components created each of these data points, we could start to look at how to unpick the platform and take things away slowly. We also had time in our favor. There wasn't a great urgency to do this. We knew decisions were going to take a long time. We had a decent level of resource on the team, although we didn't have a lot of domain experience. So we treated the project as a learning experience, right? So we had a couple of new engineers come in to understand, how a decommissioning work, how infrastructure as code could work, how we could remove elements through Terraform, for example, or whatever. So these last two slides, obviously the data and the dependency diagram, tie out of what we wanted to achieve in the discovery phase. So on to what we did in this example, really a bit more through the decommission itself, and how we helped to manage it. The first thing we spoke about were dependencies, and we did find a couple. We weren't sure that we had uncovered every dependency, and you never quite are, I think, in this world, but we found a couple. We decided to we didn't want to end up like Charmander in this diagram, right, and start a fire somewhere, try and put it out, start a fire somewhere else, and end up going around in circles chasing our tails. So once we understood the dependency we had identified, we added some regression tests to give us confidence in an automated fashion, right, and potentially also highlight any dependencies we might have missed. And for some of the team, that was a good experience on how to implement this sort of thing. We had one which was an Azure DevOps pipeline, which replicated some of the functionality we needed to retain, and then it kind of checked the resources were still there for Platform C. And we wanted to, it kind of gave us that knowledge that we hadn't bitten off too much, or we'd taken off too much at a time, and everything was continuing to work as we expected. That was kind of it. So one of those was a storage account, and one of those was a more infrastructure level thing. So yes, on to the next bit then. So we put in these regression tests before we removed anything, because we didn't want to jeopardize ourselves. The next bit was save money, right? So we found out through some cost analysis that 85% of the cost of the platform was just on VMs. So we managed to save that money super quickly just by scaling the instances that we knew could go down to zero, and I think one or two of them we kept at one instance because it meant we didn't get access to certain other areas. But so very quickly we had identified these were provisioned by infrastructure as code. We could scale them down to zero without deleting anything, and phase one was kind of complete quite early, and we got that that confidence and trust in the business. And now I want to share an experience of what didn't work so well. So that would take us back to the dependency diagram. We did what we thought was a good amount of legwork on understanding the dependencies. So we see here hopefully the colors are okay here. The pink ones coming through as like a higher level thing, and then the green ones being a lower level dependency. So we would expect that removing websites isn't going to impact messaging, because networking and monitoring environment modules were the only things that they had in common. They were shared dependency. So we thought that would be fine, but it wasn't. So the reason we wanted to keep one of them was there was a web app that worked a bit like a support tool. We wanted to keep it so we could drop in to do manual checks on data, so that we could respond to queries on the legacy data if we needed to, and do freedom of information type requests. We hadn't inadvertently corrupted or changed the firewall on a data store and that sort of thing. So that was deployed into an app service that was provisioned by the websites component. We thought removing messaging wouldn't affect this, but as it turned out, there was some kind of really convoluted behaviors in the pipeline. But more specifically, one of the Octopus deployment steps ran some shell scripts. They used Azure CLI to get a public IP of the load balancer of the messaging to do some authentication, some authorization, sorry. So we could, when there were no VMs there was nowhere for that request to go, and then you couldn't log in to the support tool. But what we do think, we did identify that problem early. So while it was a problem, it wasn't as big a problem as it may have been. But it's an example of I think A, you can't ever find out quite everything, but B, by doing your due diligence and putting in some regression and having a good test plan to build your confidence, you can identify it sooner. So we didn't ever reach this phase where we had lost some data, then we wanted to log in, and then we couldn't log in because of X, Y, and Z. And then on to phases 2 and 3, and this was just an ongoing balancing act. Really, the 3 bits in green here were the 3 things that we wanted to achieve as a team. We had this guide rail, right, of not deleting anything unduly, reducing cost, we spoke about, and kind of maintaining the data integrity. But to make the most of the opportunity on managing the decommission here, without being super time boxed on this project, we wanted to maximize the learning so that the team were upskilled. We had, as I mentioned, firstly, a new team, but we also had a few junior developers involved, so that we're better prepared for the future and they could kind of challenge themselves. We wanted to maximize the speed, obviously, where we could, as fast as was sensible, but without overshooting data decisions. And obviously that increased learning would make us quicker in the future, as hopefully we find out with Platform C. And we wanted to reduce complexity, right? We didn't want to make it harder than it needed to be. We didn't want to gold plate at the expense of learning or speed, if we didn't have to. So there's opportunities and costs with that balancing act. And we had, again, time being on our side, we had a great chance for pairing, knowledge transfer, understanding the processes that go into decommissioning. We had siloed knowledge on Terraform, for example, which, for those that don't know, is an infrastructure as code software tool, and it's got like a domain specific language associated with it. We also uncovered some technologies that no one in the team had met before. So no one had used Octopus, for example, for continuous deployment and release management. None of us had used Carafe for running the applications. And then when it was an individual or two who had a bit of knowledge, we spent a bit of time, sharing that across, spending the time making sure we tried to do it right, rather than just deleting a resource manually, for example, in the cloud, because it stuck more closely with our principles here. And it gave the team, especially the newer engineers, a better understanding of the software delivery lifecycle and, what a good code base looks like, basically reflecting reality. Not many things more frustrating than the code not telling the truth about the software. And then the costs around this, we sometimes misplaced a bit of effort. We focused a little bit too hard on something, so we had to make sure we came out the rabbit hole or stuck our head above the parapet to make sure we were spending that effort correctly. Sometimes that hampered speed, but by doing it often, we kept kind of on track there. The best knowledge that we had at that time, we were doing the right thing. And then this approach to unbuilding it slowly, kind of coupled with not having data decisions, which we haven't really spoken about yet, meant it did become a bit fragmented, because we could only unbuild certain aspects of each module, and we had to keep the data parts, and it actually did increase complexity from time to time. So picking up a ticket might have introduced 2 or 3 new dependencies, so we had to be a bit pragmatic about what to do there. So the data considerations, to follow on from that last point a little bit more, we've got this system that we've spotted around the data. So all of it starts with discovering new data, really, and all of it ended up with a more complex backlog. So I'll talk about the relationships here a tiny bit. So we, as I mentioned, we didn't have a lot of domain knowledge on this platform. Each data store we kind of uncovered, we kind of had to provide an analysis, right, and recommend, I suppose, on what we think the importance of it was, or how long lived it should be, what the retention periods were, where it fitted into contracts and so on. But ultimately, the decisions had to be made by the NHS and the internal stakeholders. That leads to an intimidating first step. Many people probably know when it comes to data especially, people are a bit hesitant to take the first step. So we attempted to be proactive with a recommendation to kind of get the conversation moving. But the burden of that responsibility is quite high, right? Kicking off that conversation and getting people talking about things that no one is ever seems to be quite 100% sure on is hard. And there's a complicated decision process as well. So there's a lot of people involved, a lot of potentially legal ramifications around data in this decommissioning in particular. We had to be compliant, as I mentioned before, with GDPR, with freedom of information requests. There's also the public inquiry going on in relation to COVID. So enough has to be available for that when asked. And there's long waits. So this kind of was a two-way relationship with the decision process, but there's a lot of toing and froing. And again, every time you discover more new data, you've got to make that first step. You've got to feed it into the decision process. All of those things create the long waits. And the long waits led us to reduced options because we had to be selective in what we could decommission. The choices became a bit limited. So we kind of had maybe done 80% of the first module and then 70% of the next, and then 60% of the next. And as the data dependencies grew up, we could actually only take out a certain amount each time. And each time you reduce the scope of a story, we had a new story to go in, which was a new dependency, and it helped to bloat the backlog. So there's a lot of splitting into two or splitting into three, and we kind of left a very coherent and understandable trail of destruction behind us, but it didn't need to be there if decisions could have been made sooner. So we kind of reached this point where there was nothing left that could be turned off without deleting data, and we didn't know what data could be deleted. So we chose in this instance to be proactive about what we could do, kind of looking at all the types of data stores we had and deciding on the options that were available. So one thing we thought about was we could export everything and then we could delete it, right? So if we exported all the data somewhere, then we could turn everything off and the data would be somewhere else. We didn't quite reach this point, but this is where our thinking was going. So we set up a series of spikes to identify methods of data transfer for each of the data stores. So storage accounts, databases, SQL or Mongo databases, log analytics, workspaces. This was an Azure hosted platform, as you might have guessed. So there are a few considerations there. What's the type of data that's going and how accessible does it need to be? Does it need to be readily accessible? Do you need a key to get there? Is it encrypted data? If it is encrypted data, how do you provide the decryption key and those sorts of things? It's no good transferring that data if nobody can access it, or if people who shouldn't be able to access it can get there. And then once we knew where and once we knew what the storage was and where it should go, or the options there, we started thinking about how it could happen, right? So some of these methods are limited by the size of the data sets. Some of them are limited by security. Some of them aren't necessarily compatible with each other. So an example of this was we knew there was a party who had a way of importing .back files for their SQL databases. But in Azure SQL, they create .backpack files. So we kind of worked through a process with them to understand how they could improve their process to a more cloud-based file format. But anyway, once we had kind of outlined all of these, we knew what we could do with every piece of data, and we did get the data decisions in. So we could delete some parts without having to transfer it, and then other bits we did transfer. So I'll take us on to some of our lessons learned here, and I did mention a few times about this platform C as well. So we tried to take some of those learnings from that couple of months to work to our advantage for Platform C. Mostly, or the biggest one being to try and get some data decisions as early as possible. A lot of them were reapplicable, so it was a very similar process. There's very similar data stored, right, around patients and results and so on. So the pattern was similar, which was helpful for getting decisions soon. And we did start the Platform C decommissioning with the data decisions beforehand, which meant we could tackle it in a more modular way. We also kind of had that knowledge from the spikes about how to transfer, so we knew for the ones that we needed to keep how we were going to do that. And the team had been through the process of decommissioning, so that was a lot more easy for them the second time around. I actually rolled off the project before the Platform C decommissioning, so I was really encouraged to see how ably they took that process on of managing that decommission. So we had a smoother ride of it. The bloated backlog didn't happen because we didn't discover new data stores. We knew everything up front. It was kind of really streamlined, like lean process. And then these are a few like boxes on things to think about, I suppose, things that we learned here that we'll be asking next time. So requesting for data decisions in advance, spoken about that a lot already, but it helps with planning. We got exploring dependencies as early as possible. So I touched on that, but there's technical dependencies, obviously, but there's non-technical or non-code dependencies as well around authorization or access to tools. For example, we didn't have Octopus logins to start with. There's areas of the cloud platform that we had to export data to that we didn't have permission, subscription level permission to access. There's exporting data up front. I think that's an option. If your data stores are really tightly coupled with your application and you need to turn it off, you could think about exporting it all and then managing the application turning off separately. Undertaking the discovery, so obviously we did that today. I think proper planning can really help with a successful delivery. It's like the bit towards the start, really, identifying user needs, the most important aspects of the decommission, provides really good guide rails for the work. And not kind of explicitly on here, but it helps to build the trust with the business, you know, and that sort of thing as well, to kind of, you know what you're talking about, you provide a plan, you set it all out. Sharing knowledge as early and often as possible, especially with unknowns. I think this is especially important when the learning curve is steep. So we were uncovering a lot around the domain, quite a bit around the technologies involved. Also, if one person knows it, you want to share that as soon as possible, because if they're, you know, if they're ill or have holiday booked or whatever, then it becomes a problem. And I think also this is especially important if the user needs are being replaced by a new service. So this was the case in the Platform C decommission, about kind of sharing that knowledge and those requirements and what happens to everything early. And in this example for Platform C, there was a dual running period, but while we were doing Platform B, we were working with the new provider for Platform C about what requirements there were and all those sorts of things, and how they should be thinking about managing the data, what we needed to send. Working in the open, so again, it's similar to sharing knowledge, but being transparent on the goals, on the progress, keep the business involved. We had a brilliant BA working with us who was had real trust in the team, really confident in our ability, and he could go to the business comfortable and confident that it was being managed well. Yeah, highlight blockers, keep documentation up to date. You know, one thing that did happen a bit in the Platform B decom was copies of Excel documents, and well, we probably all felt that pain, I expect. Do what it takes to give you confidence. In this case, we built the regression tests. It really empowered the team, especially the more junior members, to have that confidence, to let them look forwards rather than look backwards all the time. You know, if we get a notification that a build failed or that automated pipeline had failed, then for our regression test, then we knew straight away that we'd done something that we had to look at rectifying. And giving thoughts to decommissioning when building. So I've got another slide on this just coming up as our big thing for building services in the future. But separation of concerns, and it makes people's lives easier when the time comes to switch off a service. So when you're building a deployment pipeline, don't skip building a teardown pipeline as well. So this takes us to the final slide, really, and I think the key takeaway that I've taken, I've tried to share with people at Maytech in particular. So you might be sitting or standing or watching here today, you know, working on building and improving a live service, and think like turning it off is someone else's problem in X years' time, and it probably will. But if you think that for a moment that it might be you that needs to do that in 5 years' time, you're still there and you've been doing something else for 5 years, would you have all those answers? Would you remember everything? Do you know how to reset that particular thing? Are there pockets of code in there that you can't wait to forget about because it's like a bit of a spider web, or there's a massive dependencies inside it? And also, so easier life for future you, there's what that is about. I think also that decommissioning isn't necessarily the same as retiring or as large scale as we tend to think traditionally. I've kind of come to think of it as it can be quite small fry as well. So it can be replacing a service or a module or using a new integration. But we still need to plan about how we can switch those in and out with ease. So if you've got a bunch of integrations in either direction, people integrating with you or you integrating with others, you know, how hard would it be for you, or worse for someone else, really, to try and turn some aspect of that off? So less coupling. We got, you know, I think that if we have decommissioning in mind and separation of concerns in mind, we can make the code base more modular. One of the engineers on the team was really passionate about separating the data from the application pipelines and stuff, for example. So it will lead to the code base being a bit more modular. And yeah, that's that one. There's cost sensitivity thing here, I think. So we should always want to be aware of costs, right? If we make something easy to turn off, it's going to save the business money, and you'll get a pat on the back, or you know, maybe a pay rise. We'll see. So, but it saves time, right? I think if it's easy to do, it's going to be quicker to do. If it's quicker to do, it saves money, as well as obviously all the costs associated with running the software itself. And it gives a bit more flexibility, right? You know, technology is always changing, always becoming better. It's kind of a living organism sometimes. So if you want to change your repository layer, you want to use a new data store, you want to change your document generator or change your library, you know, adding things in and out after having, well, I say decommissioning in mind, but changing elements of your integrations. It's, you know, it makes your life a bit easier, you're a bit more supple. So I think that is my last slide. I think we're ready for questions and comments. Don't know if you want to come back in, Adam.
Hey, Reuben, that was excellent. Thanks for that. I've certainly learned an awful lot in the last half an hour or so. And yes, so much more to consider to decommissioning than I kind of first thought. And we do have some questions. So if you're okay to be in the hot seat for a couple more minutes, Reuben. So one of the questions is, what would you say was the biggest challenge in this project? And thinking about the balancing act slide and all the things that had to be considered.
I think the biggest challenge really was nailing down the data decisions. In some respects, for what we wanted to achieve, it was helpful that they took time, because we wanted to treat it as a learning experience and kind of that sort of thing. But it was quite tricky to pick the right work to do without knowing what those decisions were. I think also for me personally, we had, I mentioned it a few times, but a fairly green team. So making sure that they had the right level of autonomy, the right level of support. You know, I can't ask them to alter an Octopus deploy pipeline if they haven't got access to Octopus. So that kind of aspect was also quite tricky for me. But overall, the data was the hardest part.
And that makes sense. And there's a couple of other questions sort of thought of as you were speaking. Mm-hmm. And obviously planning is, I guess, a crucial part to the success of this project. And I know there's lots of learnings along the way. What would you say was the biggest challenge whilst you were planning the project as well?
I think planning wise, it was just finding that time to have those discussions with the stakeholders, the internal stakeholders, and understanding what good looked like for them. I identified those two groups, right? The users that aren't us and the users that are us. But the discovery in our example, the public was quite an easy one, because the service NHS was doing all that correspondence. It wasn't a service anymore. I didn't have all the relationships with the stakeholders internally to know what they wanted, so we had to build those quite quickly. I had a very definite view of what I wanted, because I didn't know how we deployed the code. I was really interested in the path to production and identifying the dependencies. So yeah, hopefully that answers it.
No, absolutely. And sort of final question, I really liked your slide around building to decommission. Would you say that, I guess, taking this approach helps promote overall best practice development?
Yeah, definitely. I think I can't see it going against any principles that I know of a good software development. I've been in a situation myself where it's not like that, right? I think that's one of the things that opened my eyes a bit during it. Well, how do we make decommissioning easier for people in the future? We don't know how long something is going to last. So yeah, I don't think they go against any good practices. I think it's going to always be good, and it kind of lends itself nicely to modularization, cohesive, decoupled code, and that sort of thing.
Brilliant. No, that's excellent. Again, well, thanks very much, Reuben. And we're going to be wrapping up the webinar now. If there's any sort of further follow-up questions or comments that you have, please feel free to reach out to us either via our marketing email, LinkedIn, or we've got lots of information on the website. Will also be just a reminder that we'll be sending out a feedback form as well. So if you could please respond to this with any feedback you've had from today's session, that'd be greatly appreciated. And thank you very much.
Thank you.